They say memory sharpens with age, but that is a lie. It rusts. It flakes away like the cheap paint on a winter camouflaged helmet, leaving only the bare, pitted iron beneath. I cannot tell you with certainty if the sky that morning was the color of bruised slate or the pale, sickly white of a cataract eye. I cannot remember if we had eaten bread or sawdust sausage, but I remember the grease. I remember the viscosity of the weapon's oil on my fingertips, thick and unwilling in the sub-zero air. It smelled of synthesized petroleum and something sharper, something acrid that clung to the pores and refused to wash away, even decades later when I scrubbed my hands in a porcelain sink in a warm, rebuilt Dortmund. My hands were younger then, lacking the tremors that spill my coffee today. They were steady, stained black in the creases. I sat in the bottom of a foxhole that we had carved out of the frozen steppe, a shallow grave for the living. The earth was not soil. It was a composite material, hard as concrete, woven through with the crystallized roots of dead grass. I had the bolt of my carabiner 98K disassembled on a ragged cloth spread across my knees. Stripping the weapon was a liturgy. It was the only thing that made sense. In the Rue Jebiet, before the world went mad, I worked the line at the Hoche Steelworks. I was not a soldier then. I was a machinist. I understood the language of tolerance, of torque, of thermal expansion. Metal had rules. If you treated the steel with respect, if you lubricated the gears and calibrated the lathe, the machine produced. It created. There was a rhythm to the factory floor, a percussive symphony of steam hammers and grinding wheels that felt like the heartbeat of civilization. We made things. We took raw, chaotic ore and imposed order upon it. The Eastern Front had no order. It was a machine that had broken its governor, spinning wildly, shaking itself to pieces, chewing up the operators. I wiped the firing pin with a rag that was stiffer than the steel itself. My breath hung before me in a suspended cloud, freezing instantly on my eyelashes. I checked the safety lever, the extractor claw. The metal burned my skin, a cold so profound it felt indistinguishable from a searing iron. This rifle was not a tool of creation. It was a mechanism designed to stop engines, the engines of tanks, the engines of trucks, the biological engines of men. I reassembled the bolt. The pieces slid together with a friction that I could feel in my teeth. It was a sensation of perfect fit, the only perfection available in this wasteland. When I slid the bolt back into the receiver, it locked home with a heavy, solid sensation that vibrated through the wood stock and into my shoulder. It was the feeling of a door closing. The silence out there was heavy. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of waiting. The steppe stretched out endlessly, a white void that swallowed depth perception. You could look at a drift of snow and not know if it was 10 meters away or a kilometer. It was a landscape designed to expose you. That was the fear that sat in my gut, heavier than the stale rations. It wasn't dying. Death is just the machine switching off. It was the thought of being pinned, the thought of the Soviet advance sweeping over me, of being captured, of being a cog that couldn't turn, held fast in the grip of a hostile mechanic, to be immobilized in the open, unable to retreat, unable to hide, just waiting for the hammer to fall. That was the terror, the loss of function. I settled the rifle on the lip of the trench, wrapping a strip of white burlap around the barrel to break its silhouette. I pressed my eye to the scope. The glass was cold against my orbital bone. The world narrowed to a circle of magnification. Crosshairs, a vertical line bisecting a horizontal one. Cartesian coordinates imposed on chaos. A single snowflake drifted down from the gray ceiling of the world. I watched it through the Zeiss lens. It was large, intricate, a perfect stellar dendrite. It tumbled in the dead air, completely indifferent to the minefields and the barbed wire. It landed on the elevation turret of my scope. I held my breath. I watched the delicate ice structure hold its form for a second, 2 seconds, defying the warmth radiating from the metal, before it collapsed into a tiny bead of water. I exhaled. The waiting was an ache in the joints. It was a physical pressure compressing the chest. Then, the horizon tore open. It started as a low vibration in the soles of my boots, deeper than sound. a tectonic grinding. Then the air itself seemed to shatter. The sky to the east dissolved into streaks of screaming fire. Katyushas, Stalin's organs. The sound arrived a moment later, a wailing, tearing shriek that sounded like the sky was being ripped like cheap canvas. The world turned upside down. The trench wall disintegrated. I was thrown backward not by a push, but by a violent displacement of air. The logic of the factory vanished. There were no manuals for this. The earth erupted in geysers of black mud and white snow, spraying the air with debris that pattered against my helmet like hail. The noise was absolute. It ceased to be sound and became a physical medium we were drowning in. I scrambled upright, my hands grasping for the rifle before I grasped for my own limbs. The instinct was mechanical. Secure the primary tool. Dirt rained down, filling my collar, gritting between my teeth. I spat a mixture of saliva and soil. The order came down the line, not as a voice, but as a series of frantic gestures, and the terrified eyes of the unteroffizier waving us forward. Forward, into that. We surged up the embankment, crossing the threshold from the relative safety of the earth into the kill zone. This was the aftermath of Citadel, the long, bleeding retreat, but in this moment, we were counterattacking into the teeth of hell to buy time for the transport trucks. I ran, my legs pumped, heavy with the weight of winter gear, clumsy in the knee-deep drifts. To my left, a boy I think was named Hank, or maybe Hank was the one who died in Kiev, I can't be sure anymore, stumbled. He was young, fresh from the replacement depots, still believing in the propaganda newsreels. He looked at me, his mouth opening to shout something, perhaps a warning, perhaps a plea. A mortar shell landed 3 meters to his left. There was no cinematic explosion, no slow-motion fall. 1 second he was a biological entity, a collection of levers and pulleys and pumps running on adrenaline. The next he was a red mist and a scattering of wet rags. The physics of it were appalling. The energy transfer was instantaneous. He didn't die. He was unmade. The heat of the blast washed over me, momentarily banishing the winter chill with the stench of ozone and cooked meat. I didn't stop. The factory logic kicked in. If a gear shears, the machine continues to spin until the main drive is cut. I was part of the main drive. I dove into a crater, the impact jarring my teeth. I slid the rifle forward, the barrel seeking a target. The landscape ahead was alive with muzzle flashes, sparkling like angry fireflies against the gloom. Dark shapes moved against the snow, Soviet infantry, advancing behind the rolling barrage of T-34s. The tanks roared, their diesel engines belching black smoke that stained the pristine white. They were crude machines, rough-welded and unpolished, but they worked. They ground forward with an inexorable, crushing weight. I focused. I shut out the screaming. I shut out the roar of the tank treads. I became the mechanism. My eye found the scope again. The crosshairs settled. I saw a Soviet officer waving a pistol, urging his men forward. He was shouting, his breath puffing out in white clouds. He was a variable in the equation that needed to be removed. I adjusted the elevation. 200 meters. Wind negligible. Temperature impacts ballistics. Cold air is denser. The bullet drops faster. I compensated instinctively, a calculation made without numbers. I exhaled, emptying my lungs until there was a natural pause in the respiratory cycle. My heart rate slowed. The chaos of the battlefield existed in a different dimension. In my circle of glass, there was only the target. My finger found the trigger. I applied pressure. The slack was taken up. I felt the sear engage, the precise, machined point where the potential energy waited to be released. The break was crisp. The stock kicked back into my shoulder, a sharp, familiar punch. Through the scope I saw the result. The officer's head snapped back. He crumpled. It was not violent. It was simply the removal of support. Gravity took over. He fell into the snow and did not rise. I worked the bolts, up, back, forward, down. The brass casing ejected, spinning into the mud, steaming as it hit the ice. Another round chambered. The disconnect was total. I had just ended a universe. A man with a mother, perhaps a wife, certainly a history, was now just geometry in the snow. But I felt nothing but the satisfaction of a mechanic who has successfully diagnosed and repaired a fault. The rifle held 0. The ammunition was consistent. Then the world shifted again. The Soviet tanks were closer now, their machine guns raking the crater lip. The snow around me erupted in tiny geysers. The air snapped with the passage of supersonic lead. "Pull back," someone screamed. "They're flanking." I looked to my right. A machine gun crew was trying to displace. They were dragging the heavy MG-42 through the mud. One of them, the loader, slipped. A burst of fire from the advancing T-34 caught him. It shattered his thigh. I saw the leg twist at an angle that anatomy does not permit. He went down screaming a high, thin sound that cut through the rumble of the diesel engines. He tried to crawl, dragging the ruined limb, leaving a broad, dark streak of blood on the white canvas of the steppe. He looked at us. He looked at me. He was 10 meters away, out in the open, exposed on the flat table of snow. The tank was turning its turret toward him. He was pinned. He was broken machinery, left to rust in the path of the crusher. He was the manifestation of my nightmare, screaming for a salvation that the laws of physics and war could not provide. I watched him, and for a moment, my hands froze on the bolt. The scope picture offered a different reality, a clean world. Through the glass, I found the source of the coordination. A Soviet officer, a major, stood exposed in the turret of a command vehicle 300 meters back. He was shouting, pointing, directing the steel beasts that were grinding our line into paste. He was the brain. The boy screaming in the snow was just debris. To take the shot was my function. I was a component designed for this exact moment. Align, exhale, squeeze. The major dies. The tank attack falters. The unit survives. It is simple arithmetic. It is the logic of the assembly line. You do not stop the conveyor belt for a dropped screw. But the screw was screaming. My pulse hammered against the walnut stock. I could feel the rhythm of it in my cheek, a chaotic tempo that defied the discipline of the rifle. The major was perfect, stationary, unaware, a target that snipers pray for. To kill him was duty. To ignore him was treason. The loader tried to stand. His leg folded like wet cardboard. He collapsed, face down, fingers clawing at the ice. The tank tracks churned closer to him, spitting mud. He was going to be crushed, not shot, erased. I looked at the major. I looked at the boy. The factory in Dortmund taught me that efficiency is God. If a gear grinds, you replace it. If a belt snaps, you discard it. The Wehrmacht is a machine that does not stop for broken parts. To save him was inefficient. It was illogical. It was the death of the soldier I had built myself to be. I took a breath. The air was sharp, tasting of cordite and diesel. I did not squeeze the trigger. I lowered the barrel. The major lived. The logic died. I pulled the rifle in tight to my chest, not to fire, but to carry. I pushed myself up from the crater. The air above me hissed with the passage of invisible death. I left the cover. I left the safety of the mechanism. I crawled into the open. The snow was thigh-deep. Every inch was a negotiation with gravity. I reached him. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, seeing nothing but pain. I grabbed his tunic. The wool was stiff with frozen blood. He was heavy. Dead weight is a phrase people use lightly. They do not know the density of a man who has given up hope. I dragged him. My boots slipped on the ice. The tank fire chewed the earth behind us, a sewing machine stitching a line of destruction inches from my heels. I didn't look back. I pulled until my muscles tore and my lungs tasted like iron filings. I became a beast of burden, stripping away the precision, the calculation, the ego. I was just flesh dragging flesh through the dirt. We tumbled over the ridge. Friendly hands grabbed us. Not gentle hands, desperate ones. They hauled us into the trench, a tangle of limbs and equipment. The medic descended on him immediately. I sat against the frozen mud wall. My hands shook. Not from the cold, from the crash of adrenaline. The Hauptmann walked past. He looked at me. Then he looked at the rifle I had dragged back, clotted with mud. The scope knocked out of alignment. Useless. He looked out at the field where the Soviet major was still directing the advance. He knew I had passed up the shot. He knew I had chosen a broken part over the mission. His eyes were cold, hard steel. He said nothing. He didn't have to. I was no longer a precision instrument to him. I was a liability. But the men, the riflemen, the other gears in the engine, they nodded. A subtle tilt of the chin, a touch on the shoulder as they passed. They saw a man who had refused to let the machine eat one of its own. That was 40 years ago. I sit here now in my apartment in Dortmund. The street outside is quiet. My workbench is covered in brass springs, escapements and pendulums. I fix clocks now. I make time run smoothly again. I take the broken things and I make them tick. But I know the truth. The newsreels, the speeches, the rallies, they told us we were part of a glorious, unstoppable engine. Indestructible, perfect, they lied. An engine does not bleed. An engine does not scream for its mother in the snow. I saved a man that day. He lost the leg, but he lived. He sends me a card every Christmas from Hamburg. He has grandchildren. The officer would have said I failed, that the machine stuttered because of me, that the war was lost because of moments like that. But when I look at the gears on my table, I do not see the Wehrmacht. I see the fragility of the tension. I was a factory worker. I built things. And in that white hell, I learned that you cannot treat a soul like a rivet. Once you strip the threads, it never holds the same way again. The machine is broken forever. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.